The Philippine Sea stretched endless and black beneath a moonless sky. I stood on the bridge of the USS Theodore Roosevelt at 300 hours, reviewing fleet operations while most of the world slept. 7,000 miles from the small Ohio town where I grew up. 7,000 miles from the mother I hadn't held in 2 years. The carrier hummed beneath my feet, 90,000 tons of American naval power cutting through dark waters. My purpose. Around me, the night watch moved with quiet efficiency, officers and enlisted personnel who trusted me with their lives, who called me Admiral and meant it. My secure phone buzzed against my hip. I expected an operational update. Instead, I saw my brother's name, Daniel. I stepped toward a quieter corner of the bridge and opened the message. "Don't bother coming. Mom doesn't want you here. She said your name and cried. You've caused enough pain." I read it 3 times. The words didn't change. They sat there glowing on that small screen while somewhere behind me, a petty officer reported routine status updates, and the machinery of naval operations continued without pause. "Mom doesn't want you here." My mother, Eleanor Whitmore, 73 years old, dying, and according to Daniel, crying at the mention of my name. I tried calling home. The landline rang once and went dead. Blocked, Daniel's cell, same result. Meredith, his wife, nothing, my father's phone, blocked, every number, every connection, severed. My hands stayed steady as I dialed the hospital directly. 23 years in the Navy teaches you to control your body, even when your heart is splintering. "Riverside General, how may I direct your call?" "Eleanor Whitmore's room, please. This is her daughter." A pause, too long. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Family has requested no outside calls be connected to Mrs. Whitmore's room." "I am family. I'm her daughter." Papers shuffling, whispered consultation. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. The patient's son has provided specific instructions. I'm not authorized to." I ended the call. My phone buzzed again. "Just stay on your little boat playing secretary. We've got this handled. The lawyer says everything's being divided among real family." I stood there, 2 stars gleaming on my collar, commander of a carrier strike group projecting American power across the Pacific, responsible for 7,500 personnel, trusted with nuclear-capable assets. And my brother thought I was a secretary, a typist on a boat. Behind me, the officer of the deck called out a heading adjustment. The Theodore Roosevelt began its slow turn, redirecting billions of dollars of military capability at my command. Countries monitored our movements through satellite imagery. The president received briefings about our operations. But Daniel Whitmore of Millbrook, Ohio, believed his little sister shuffled papers for a living. I looked out at the fleet formation, destroyers and cruisers maintaining perfect station around my flagship, their running lights winking like earthbound stars. All of it responding to my orders. All of it meaningless against the simple cruelty of a text message. This wasn't grief talking. This was calculated. The mention of the lawyer, the inheritance, real family. Daniel wasn't just keeping me from my mother's bedside. He was erasing me, making sure when she died I would have no claim, no closure, no goodbye. He built his throne on my silence, but silence was never surrender. 15 years of silence. Letting him intercept my letters, block my calls, tell our mother I had abandoned her. I chose silence because fighting him meant hurting her. I loved her too much to make her a battlefield. But now she was dying, and he was using my silence to steal her final moments. I slipped my phone into my pocket and returned to the tactical display, my face revealing nothing. The night watch continued, unaware their admiral had just received news that would break most people. I had decisions to make, and unlike my brother, I knew how to make them. To understand why I didn't simply call Daniel a liar and move on, you need to understand our history. You need to understand how a woman can command a carrier strike group and still feel powerless against her own family. I was 18 when I left for Navy boot camp. The summer of 2002, 3 months after graduating near the top of my class, desperate to escape a house where I had always been invisible. Daniel stood in the driveway that morning, arms crossed, smirking at my single duffel bag. "You'll wash out in a week," he said. "Girls like you don't belong in the military." My father stood behind him, hands in his pockets, watching me load my bag into the taxi. He didn't contradict Daniel. He didn't wish me luck. He just shrugged and said, "Let her try." Let her try. Like I was a child attempting something adorable and doomed. Like the military was a phase I would outgrow once I realized how hard real life could be. I didn't wash out. I graduated boot camp with honors. I was selected for officer candidate school. I earned my commission and reported to my first duty station aboard a guided missile destroyer, and I wrote home every single week. Long letters about what I was learning, what I was seeing, how much I missed them. I asked about Mom's garden. I asked about Dad's retirement plans. I even asked about Daniel, trying to build some bridge across the distance that had always separated us. No one ever wrote back. I called on Sundays when I could, navigating the time difference and limited phone access. Most calls went to voicemail. The few times someone answered, the conversations were brief. Mom sounded distracted. Dad handed the phone off quickly. Daniel, if he picked up at all, made excuses to end the call within minutes. I told myself they were busy. I told myself civilian life moved differently than military life. I told myself the distance would close when I came home on leave. It didn't. My first deployment took me to the Persian Gulf in 2006. I was 22, a newly minted lieutenant junior grade, serving as a division officer aboard the USS Fitzgerald. We spent 7 months conducting maritime security operations, and I sent letters, emails, and care package requests home whenever I could. Nothing came back, not a single package, not one reply to my emails. When I finally got shore leave and called home directly, Daniel answered. "Mom's busy with real family," he said. "Stop bothering us." He hung up before I could respond. I learned later, much later, that he had been intercepting my letters since the beginning. Every envelope I sent, he pulled from the mailbox before Mom could see it. Every email I wrote to the family address, he deleted. He told our parents I had stopped communicating, that I was too busy with my important Navy career to bother with them. He painted me as cold, ambitious, ungrateful. And they believed him. Why wouldn't they? Daniel was there. Daniel was present. Daniel handled the bills and maintained the house and drove Mom to her appointments. I was just a name that occasionally appeared on caller ID, quickly dismissed. By the time I made lieutenant commander at 29, I had stopped expecting anything from them. I called home to share the news, foolishly hopeful that a promotion might matter. Daniel answered again. "Mom's busy," he said, that same dismissive tone. "She doesn't have time for your little updates. Some of us have real responsibilities." I could hear her in the background, asking who was on the phone. Daniel covered the receiver and said something I couldn't make out. When he came back, his voice was smug. "She says congratulations, whatever. Look, we're about to have dinner. Stop calling so much. It upsets her." I was serving aboard an aircraft carrier at the time, responsible for the combat readiness of an entire air wing. Real responsibilities. But to Daniel, I was still the little sister playing dress-up in a uniform. The real cruelty began when Mom was diagnosed with early-onset dementia. She was 61. I was 33, recently selected for commander, serving as executive officer aboard a cruiser in the Western Pacific. I requested emergency leave the moment I heard. The request was denied, not by the Navy, but by my own family. Daniel contacted my command's ombudsman and told them I wasn't needed, that my presence would only confuse Mom and make things worse. He claimed to speak for the family. He said they had it handled. My commanding officer called me into his office, confused. "Your brother says you're estranged from your mother, says you haven't spoken in years and showing up now would cause problems." I stood there in my service dress blues, medals on my chest, and explained that my brother was lying. My co looked at me with sympathy, but what could he do? Family matters were family matters. The emergency leave was technically approved. Whether I used it was up to me. I went home anyway. I took 30 days and flew back to Ohio, determined to see my mother, to cut through whatever poison Daniel had been spreading. She didn't recognize me. Not at first. I walked into her room at the care facility Daniel had chosen, and she looked at me with polite confusion. "Are you one of the nurses?" "Mom, it's Rachel, your daughter." Her face clouded. "Rachel," but Daniel said. "He said you didn't want to see me anymore. He said you were too busy." I tried to explain. I showed her pictures, told her stories from our past, held her hand and spoke softly about memories we shared. Slowly, recognition flickered. She smiled. She called me her Rachel. For 3 beautiful days, I had my mother back. Then Daniel arrived. He made a scene, accused me of upsetting her, confusing her, being selfish. He pulled me aside and told me that every visit I made erased weeks of stability. He said the doctors recommended limited visitors. He said I was making everything worse. I left, not because I believed him, but because Mom was crying and confused and caught between 2 children who couldn't be in the same room without conflict. I left because fighting Daniel meant hurting her. That was the choice I made. I chose her peace over my presence. 3 years later, I made the Admiral selection list. Rear Admiral, lower half, one of the youngest women to achieve flag rank in the Navy's history. I sent an official announcement to my family, the kind printed on formal Navy stationery with the Secretary's seal. Daniel told everyone it was spam, junk mail, or when pressed, my fantasy about being important. He laughed about it at Thanksgiving dinner. I was told later by a distant cousin who still occasionally answered my calls. "Rachel sent some fake letter claiming she's an admiral," he reportedly said. "She's always been delusional." My last visit home was 2 years ago. A rare convergence of leave time and family events, my uncle's 70th birthday. I wore civilian clothes, mentioned nothing about my rank, tried simply to exist in the same space as people who shared my blood. At dinner, Daniel stood up and made a toast. He thanked everyone for coming. He praised Dad for his years of hard work. He celebrated Mom's strength despite her illness. Then he turned to me with that familiar smirk. "And of course, little Rachel made it, our family's famous secretary. She files papers on a boat somewhere." He laughed. Others laughed with him. "Maybe she can organize the gift receipts for us." I looked around the table. My father was studying his plate. My uncle was chuckling. My cousin Greg was grinning. Meredith had her hand over her mouth, hiding her smile. No one defended me. No one corrected him. They all believed what Daniel had spent 20 years telling them, that I was nothing. I finished my meal in silence and left the next morning. Meanwhile, the Navy trusted me with a carrier strike group. Admirals sought my counsel. The Secretary of the Navy knew my name. I had received commendations from presidents and conducted operations that would remain classified for decades. 7,500 sailors followed my orders without hesitation. But to my family, I was a secretary on a little boat. I stood on the bridge for another hour after those texts arrived, my mind running calculations that had nothing to do with fleet movements. My mother was dying. I had known for weeks through discreet channels. Eleanor Whitmore's condition had deteriorated rapidly. The dementia had progressed to the point where she rarely recognized anyone, but her body was failing too. Heart, lungs, the slow collapse of a woman who had once tended roses and sung me to sleep. But I hadn't known how little time remained. At 400, I retreated to my stateroom and opened my secure laptop. The Navy's intelligence resources are vast, and while I would never abuse them for personal gain, verifying my mother's medical status fell within boundaries I was willing to navigate. A few calls to the right people. A discreet inquiry through channels that existed for situations where flag officers needed information quickly. Within an hour, I had confirmation. My mother had been moved to hospice care 3 days ago. Prognosis, 48 to 72 hours. Daniel had known this when he sent those texts. I also learned something else. Daniel had contacted the family estate attorney 2 days prior, requesting an expedited review of the will. He had presented himself as the sole responsible family member and asked about contesting provisions that might favor absent relatives. My brother wasn't just keeping me from saying goodbye. He was positioning himself to claim everything. The house, the savings, the trust our grandparents had left. My absence would make it easier to argue that I had abandoned the family. I sat in darkness, listening to the ship breathe around me. 23 years. I had given 23 years to the Navy, sacrificing holidays and birthdays and the simple pleasure of being present for people I loved. I had missed my father's retirement party. I had missed my mother's 70th birthday. I had missed countless Christmases and ordinary Sundays. I had made those sacrifices willingly. I believed in the mission, but I had never agreed to be erased. A knock at my stateroom door. My chief of staff, Captain Morrison, entered at my word. "Admiral, the watch commander mentioned you seemed troubled. Everything all right?" Morrison had earned my trust through years of competence and discretion. Perhaps I needed to say the words aloud. "My mother is dying, back in Ohio, days at most. My family has made it clear I'm not welcome." He understood complicated families. "What are you going to do, ma'am?" "I don't know yet." He nodded and left me to my thoughts. The next 12 hours passed in routine duties. Fleet operations continued. Briefings were conducted. I performed my role with precision, compartmentalizing the crisis where it couldn't interfere with responsibilities. But something was shifting beneath that professional surface. During a break between meetings, a young lieutenant approached me. Lieutenant Chen, promising officer on her first carrier deployment. "Admiral, I apologize for being distracted during the morning brief. I learned my mother had surgery yesterday. Nothing serious, but I wasn't there. I've never not been there when she needed me." Her eyes were red-rimmed. She was embarrassed by emotion in front of a flag officer. "Lieutenant, being away during difficult times is the hardest part of this job. The sacrifice belongs to everyone who loves us." As she walked away, her words echoed. I've never not been there. I had been absent for everything, every crisis, every decline, every moment when my mother might have wondered where her daughter was. Not because I chose ambition over family, but because Daniel had built a wall between us until my mother couldn't remember she had a daughter who loved her. What would she think when she died? That Rachel abandoned her. That Rachel never called, never wrote, never cared. Lies, all lies. But lies she believed because Daniel made sure she never heard truth. That realization crystallized something inside me. Not anger, something colder. The same focused clarity I felt when tactical situations demanded immediate decision. My mother was going to die. I couldn't change that. But I could change what she believed in her final moments. I could hold her hand and tell her I had never abandoned her, that I had spent 23 years loving her from a distance Daniel created. And I could make sure Daniel never profited from his cruelty. I returned to my stateroom and picked up the secure phone connecting me to the highest levels of Naval Command. Direct lines for operational emergencies, for moments when flag officers needed to reach decision-makers immediately. This wasn't operational, but some things transcend operations. I dialed the secretary of the Navy's direct line, a privilege extended to flag officers commanding strategic assets. His aide answered. I identified myself. "Admiral Whitmore, is this operational?" "Personal, but urgent. I need Secretary Hartwell. Tell him it's Rachel." The secretary and I had served together years ago, when he was a captain and I was a lieutenant commander. We had maintained a professional friendship through decades. "Hold please, Admiral." 30 seconds later, his voice. "Rachel, what's wrong?" I told him everything. My mother's condition, Daniel's texts, the years of lies, the inheritance grab, the burning need to reach my mother before she died believing I had never loved her. When I finished, silence. "What do you need, Rachel?" I took a breath. Transportation, fast, and maybe a small reminder to my family about who I actually am. I could hear him thinking, calculating logistics and favors owed. "You'll have both. I'll make calls. Expect movement orders within the hour." "Thank you, sir." "Rachel," his voice softened. "When you get there, give them hell, professionally, of course." I almost smiled. Of course, sir. After we disconnected, I stood in my stateroom surrounded by the evidence of everything I had built. Commendations on the wall, photos with presidents and admirals, the weight of command that had defined my adult life. Daniel thought he could erase me with a few texts and years of lies. He had no idea what he had unleashed. While I was somewhere over the Pacific, transferring from a carrier onboard delivery aircraft to a military transport that would take me stateside, life in Millbrook, Ohio, continued without any awareness of what was approaching. I know now what happened in those hours before my arrival. The details came later, pieced together from hospital staff, from the estate attorney, from the few family members who eventually found the courage to tell me the truth about what Daniel had been doing. The Whitmore family had gathered at Riverside General Hospital, taking shifts in the waiting room and rotating visits to my mother's bedside. Daniel had positioned himself as the patriarch in waiting, the responsible son managing a difficult situation with grace and competence. He greeted visitors, accepted condolences, and made decisions about flowers and funeral arrangements with an air of sorrowful authority. My father sat mostly in silence, aged beyond his years, letting Daniel handle everything the way he always had. Harold Whitmore had never been a strong man, not weak exactly, but passive, content to let others steer while he went along for the ride. When Daniel had started managing family affairs years ago, Dad simply stepped back and let it happen. Meredith worked the room like a social event, managing visitors and controlling access to my mother with the efficiency of a hospital administrator. She had a clipboard, an actual clipboard with a list of approved visitors and scheduled times. My mother was dying, and Meredith had created a spreadsheet. Uncle Vernon arrived from Columbus, grave and important, ready to discuss estate matters with Daniel whenever appropriate. The two of them had always gotten along. Vernon appreciated Daniel's business sense, his practical approach to family matters. He had long ago accepted Daniel's narrative about me, the wayward daughter who had chosen career over family, who never called, who had essentially abandoned her mother to chase military glory. Cousin Greg hovered nearby, performing whatever tasks Daniel assigned, eager to maintain his place in the family hierarchy. He had mocked me at every gathering I managed to attend over the years, always following Daniel's lead, never questioning the stories he was told. The morning of what would become the most significant day in my family's history, Daniel received a phone call, unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code. He ignored it, assuming it was spam or a political survey. He had more important things to focus on. An hour later, the hospital administrator appeared in the family waiting room. Mrs. Patterson was a composed woman in her 50s who had run Riverside General for nearly a decade. She looked nervous, which was unusual for someone in her position. "Mr. Whitmore," she approached Daniel with the deference he had come to expect. "I wanted to inform you that we've received some unusual inquiries this morning about your mother's care." Daniel frowned. "What kind of inquiries?" "Military, actually. Someone from the Department of the Navy called to verify Mrs. Whitmore's room number and current condition. They mentioned something about a VIP visit." Daniel laughed, actually laughed. "Military, that's probably my sister trying to seem important. She works in some office on a Navy base, files papers or something. Trust me, there's no VIP." Mrs. Patterson didn't look convinced, but she nodded politely. "Of course, I just wanted to keep you informed. Also, we've upgraded your mother to a private suite. Complimentary. The request came from, well, it came from quite high up." "High up where?" "I'm not entirely sure, but the call came through official channels, very official channels." Daniel dismissed her concerns with a wave. "It's probably nothing. Rachel likes to pretend she's important. She once sent us a letter claiming she was an admiral." He snorted. "An admiral? Can you imagine? She probably asked some friend to make calls, try to seem like a big shot before Mom passes. Classic Rachel." Mrs. Patterson retreated, still looking unsettled. The morning continued. More visitors arrived to pay respects. The local pastor stopped by to pray with the family. A neighbor brought casseroles. Through it all, Daniel played his role perfectly. The devoted son, the steady presence, the man holding the family together during tragedy. Around noon, strange things began happening in Millbrook. Black SUVs appeared on Main Street. Not one or two, but several, moving with purpose through a town that rarely saw anything more exotic than a new pickup truck. They didn't stop, just passed through, heading toward the outskirts of town, where the hospital sat on a small hill overlooking the valley. Sheriff Dawson received a call from the state police, who had received a call from someone federal. A courtesy notification about VIP movement in his jurisdiction. Security protocols. Nothing to be alarmed about, but local law enforcement should be aware. VIP movement, Dawson had asked. In Millbrook, who? The voice on the other end hadn't specified. Just said to expect increased activity near Riverside General Hospital and to provide assistance if requested. A local news van from the Columbus affiliate appeared, parking near the hospital entrance. The reporter, a young woman fresh out of journalism school, had received a tip about something newsworthy happening in the small town. She didn't know what exactly, but her producer had told her to get there and be ready. Inside the hospital, staff members began behaving differently. Nurses who had been casual and friendly became more formal, more attentive. Security personnel appeared in hallways where they hadn't been before. The cafeteria manager personally checked on the quality of food being served. Daniel noticed none of this. He was too focused on his performance, too absorbed in managing the family narrative to see the signs gathering around him. At 1:30 p.m., flowers arrived at the nurse's station. An enormous arrangement, professionally done, with a card that read, "For Eleanor Whitmore, with deepest respect from the officers and crew of USS Theodore Roosevelt." A nurse brought them to Daniel, confused. "These just arrived for your mother, from a Navy ship." Daniel took the card, read it, and laughed dismissively. "My sister and her delusions. She probably has friends who work in shipping or something. Throw them away." The nurse hesitated. "Sir, these are quite expensive, and the delivery was handled by a military courier. Are you sure?" "I said throw them away. My mother doesn't need reminders of the daughter who abandoned her." The flowers disappeared, but the nurse kept the card, something telling her it might be significant. At 2:15 p.m., Daniel tried to call the estate attorney, Mr. Hendricks, to discuss expediting the will review. The call went to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail. He called the office directly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore," the receptionist said. "Mr. Hendricks is in emergency meetings all afternoon. He can't be disturbed." "Emergency meetings? About what?" "I'm not at liberty to say. He'll return your call when he's available." Daniel hung up, irritated but not concerned. Lawyers were always busy with something. At 2:45 p.m., his credit card was declined at the hospital cafeteria. A simple purchase, just coffee and a sandwich, and the card wouldn't process. "That's impossible," he said, embarrassed in front of the cashier. "Run it again." Same result. He paid cash, then called his bank. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore, but there's a temporary hold on your account. We're verifying some unusual activity. It should be resolved within 24 hours. "What unusual activity? I haven't done anything unusual." "I'm not able to provide details at this time, sir. Someone from our fraud department will contact you." He hung up, frustrated but still not connecting the dots. At 3:00 p.m., Meredith returned from a walk outside, her face pale. "Daniel, there are helicopters." "What?" "Helicopters, 2 of them circling the town. They look military." Daniel went to the window. Sure enough, 2 dark shapes moved in the distance, their rotors catching the afternoon sun. Military helicopters, the kind you saw in news footage from war zones, not in the skies over rural Ohio. "Probably a training exercise," he said, though his voice was less certain now. "There's a National Guard base an hour away. They do exercises sometimes." Meredith didn't look convinced. "Daniel, what's going on?" Nothing is going on." He turned from the window. This is Rachel, somehow, making a scene, trying to upset everyone before Mom goes. It's exactly the kind of dramatic nonsense she would pull. He said it with confidence, but something cold was settling in his stomach, a premonition he couldn't quite name. At 3:30 p.m., the sound of helicopter rotors grew louder. Not distant anymore. Close, getting closer. The family gathered at the windows, watching as a military helicopter descended toward the hospital parking lot. Not a news helicopter, not a medical transport. A serious, official-looking aircraft with Navy markings clearly visible on its side. Daniel watched it land, watched the rotors slow, watched the doors open. And in that moment, though he didn't yet understand why, he knew that everything was about to change. He built his throne on my silence, but silence was never surrender, and I was done being silent. The helicopter touched down in the hospital parking lot at exactly 3:47 p.m. I know because I checked my watch as the wheels made contact, a habit from years of coordinating precision operations where seconds mattered. Through the window, I could see the town of Millbrook spreading below us, unchanged from my memories despite all the years. The same church steeples, the same water tower with the faded blue paint, the same winding roads I had driven as a teenager, dreaming of escape. And there, on the hill, Riverside General Hospital, where my mother was drawing her final breaths while my brother told everyone she didn't want to see me. The rotors slowed. My aide, Commander Torres, spoke into his radio, coordinating with the ground team that had arrived ahead of us. I sat still for a moment, breathing deeply, centering myself the way I did before any major operation. This was not a military engagement. No enemy combatants, no tactical objectives, no rules of engagement. This was family. And family, I had learned long ago, could be far more dangerous than any foreign adversary. But I was not arriving as the forgotten daughter. Not today. Today, Daniel would learn exactly who he had been lying about for 2 decades. The helicopter doors opened. Sunlight flooded the cabin, and I rose from my seat. I had dressed deliberately for this moment. Full-dress white uniform, immaculate and pressed, the kind reserved for formal occasions and ceremonies of significance. 2 stars gleamed on my shoulder boards, catching the afternoon light. My ribbons formed precise rows across my chest, each one representing a deployment, an achievement, a sacrifice. The Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit. Campaign ribbons from operations most Americans would never know about. I was not dressed for a funeral. I was dressed to be seen. Commander Torres exited first, followed by my flag aide, Lieutenant Commander Reyes. They took positions on either side of the helicopter door, standing at attention as I descended. Behind me, 4 additional Navy officers emerged, all in dress whites, all moving with the practiced precision of people who understood ceremony and the power of presentation. The parking lot had been cleared by local security working in coordination with my advance team. A corridor extended from the helicopter to the hospital entrance, lined with hospital staff who had been told a VIP was arriving, but hadn't been told who. They stood watching, curious and confused, as the formation took shape. I could see faces in the hospital windows. Patients, nurses, visitors, all drawn by the sound of the helicopter, all wondering what could possibly bring military aircraft to their small-town hospital. I couldn't see my family from this distance, but I knew they were watching. Daniel would be watching. Let him watch. Secretary Hartwell had insisted on doing this properly. "If you're going to remind them who you are," he had said during our final call before I departed, "then remind them completely. No ambiguity, no room for Daniel to spin another story." He had arranged everything. The helicopter, the escort officers, the advance coordination with local authorities. He had even sent his personal aide to accompany me, ensuring that anyone who doubted my rank would have immediate confirmation from the secretary's own office. I straightened my cover, took a breath, and began walking toward the hospital. The formation moved with me. Commander Torres on my right, Lieutenant Commander Reyes on my left, the other officers falling into position behind us. Our footsteps echoed in unison across the pavement, a cadence that announced our approach more effectively than any words. Hospital staff began to realize something significant was happening. A security guard reached for his radio. A nurse pressed her hand to her mouth. An elderly man in a wheelchair was rolled to the window by his grandson, both of them staring. We reached the hospital entrance. The automatic doors slid open, and the formation entered the lobby. Inside, everything stopped. The receptionist froze mid-sentence, phone pressed to her ear. A family in the waiting area turned as one, their conversation dying. A doctor walking toward the elevator halted, coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. The only sound was our footsteps on the polished floor, measured and deliberate, announcing our presence with every step. Commander Torres moved ahead and spoke to the security guard at the front desk, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Rear Admiral Rachel Whitmore, United States Navy, arriving to see her mother, Eleanor Whitmore. Please direct us to her room. The guard blinked, processing the words. He looked from Torres to me, his eyes moving across my uniform, counting stars, reading ribbons. His posture changed, straightening instinctively the way people do when they recognize authority. Yes, sir, ma'am, Admiral, he fumbled with his radio. I'll need to, let me just. Mrs. Patterson, the hospital administrator, appeared from a side corridor, moving quickly. She had clearly been alerted to our arrival and had been waiting. Her face showed a mixture of awe and anxiety. Admiral Whitmore. She extended her hand, which I shook firmly. We've been expecting you. Your mother has been moved to our private suite on the 3rd floor. I'll escort you personally. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. We moved toward the elevators, the formation adapting smoothly to the indoor environment. Staff members lined the hallway, some standing at attention without quite knowing why, others simply staring in disbelief. A few reached for their phones, recording video, taking pictures. Let them. Let the whole town see. The elevator doors opened. Mrs. Patterson held them as we entered, the space barely accommodating our group. During the brief ride to the 3rd floor, she spoke carefully. Admiral, I want you to know that we received your mother's medical records from the Navy liaison this morning. We've made every accommodation, and I want to apologize for any confusion regarding visitor access. We were given information that, I now understand, may not have been accurate. The information came from my brother Daniel. Yes, ma'am. He told you I was estranged, that I had abandoned my mother, that my presence would upset her. Mrs. Patterson's silence was confirmation enough. None of that was true, I said simply, but you couldn't have known. The doors opened on the 3rd floor, and we emerged into a corridor that had been transformed. Security personnel stood at intervals. The nurses' station had been straightened, organized, every surface cleared of clutter. The staff stood at attention, or their version of it, watching our approach with wide eyes. And there, at the end of the hallway, outside what I assumed was my mother's private suite, stood my family. Daniel saw me first. I watched the recognition cross his face, followed immediately by confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like fear. He was holding a coffee cup, and as my formation approached, as the reality of what he was seeing finally penetrated his understanding, the cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. He didn't seem to notice. He was staring at my uniform, at my stars, at the ribbons that told a story 20 years in the making. My father stood slowly from a waiting room chair, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He reached for the wall to steady himself, his face pale. Uncle Vernon fumbled with his glasses, putting them on, taking them off, putting them on again, as if better vision might change what he was seeing. Meredith backed away, her hand moving to her phone, deleting something. Evidence, probably. The messages she had sent spreading Daniel's lies. The posts mocking the family secretary who couldn't be bothered to visit her dying mother. Cousin Greg simply stood frozen, sweat visible on his forehead, unable to meet my eyes. Commander Torres stepped forward and spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the corridor. Make way for Rear Admiral Rachel Whitmore, Commander of Carrier Strike Group 9, recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit with Gold Star, and the Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V. The Admiral commands the USS Theodore Roosevelt and her escort vessels, responsible for over 7,500 personnel and assets valued in excess of $15 billion. He paused, letting the words settle. The Admiral is here to see her mother. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the soft hum of medical equipment from somewhere down the hall. I walked forward, my formation remaining in position behind me. Each step brought me closer to the family that had spent 2 decades believing I was nothing. Each step was a refutation of every lie Daniel had told. I stopped directly in front of my brother. He was taller than me, always had been, but in that moment he seemed to shrink. His face had gone from pale to gray, and his hands were trembling visibly at his sides. "Hello, Daniel," I said quietly. "I got your text, the one telling me to stay on my little boat playing secretary." I glanced at the officers behind me, at the stars on my shoulders, at the weight of everything I represented. I decided to come anyway. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. From down the corridor, I heard whispers beginning. Hospital staff, family members, patients who had emerged from their rooms to see what the commotion was about. The story was already spreading. The secretary daughter was an admiral. The abandoned sister commanded an aircraft carrier. The nothing girl had become something extraordinary. And Daniel, who had built his entire identity on diminishing me, had nowhere left to hide. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Daniel stood before me, mouth working soundlessly, the broken coffee cup at his feet forming a brown puddle that neither of us acknowledged. Behind him, my father had lowered himself back into his chair, head in his hands. Uncle Vernon was still fumbling with his glasses. Meredith had pressed herself against the wall as if hoping it might swallow her whole. It was my father who finally spoke. "Rachel," his voice cracked on my name. He looked up at me with wet eyes, his face a map of confusion and dawning horror. "Rachel, I didn't," Daniel said. He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the lies he had swallowed for 2 decades, couldn't explain how he had watched his daughter disappear from their lives and never once questioned the narrative his son had constructed. "Daniel said what?" I asked quietly. "That I abandoned the family, that I was too busy to call, that I never wrote." My father nodded miserably, unable to meet my eyes. "I wrote every week for the first 5 years. I kept my voice steady, controlled, the same tone I used when delivering difficult briefings to superior officers. Letters about my deployments, my promotions, my life. I asked about Mom's garden. I asked about your retirement. I asked about everything." "We never got any letters," Dad whispered. "Not one." I turned to Daniel. "Tell him." My brother's face had regained some color, though it was the flushed red of panic rather than health. He shook his head slightly, a denial that convinced no one. "Tell him, Daniel. Tell him what you did with my letters." "I don't know what you're talking about." His voice was hoarse, unconvincing. "You're making this up. You always were dramatic." "Commander Tors." I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. "The folder, please." Tors stepped forward and handed me a manila folder I had prepared during my journey. Inside were copies of emails I had sent to family addresses over the years, complete with timestamps and read receipts showing they had been opened. Copies of phone records showing hundreds of calls to family numbers that had been blocked or ignored. And most damning of all, 3 of my original letters, still sealed, that the family attorney had discovered in Daniel's personal files during his review of the estate documents. I handed the folder to my father. "These are some of the letters I sent, unopened. Mr. Hendricks, the estate attorney, found them when he started looking into Daniel's caretaker expenses." I watched my father's hands shake as he opened the first envelope, yellowed with age. "I stopped sending letters after Mom's diagnosis because every time I called, every time I tried to visit, Daniel told me I was making things worse, that I was confusing her, that she didn't want to see me." Dad was reading my letter now, a missive from 12 years ago describing my first major command assignment. His lips moved silently, as he absorbed words he should have read a decade earlier. Tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I believed him," he whispered. "God help me, I believed him." We all did. Uncle Vernon had finally gotten his glasses properly situated. He was staring at Daniel with an expression of dawning fury. "You told us she was unstable. You said she had some kind of breakdown, that she'd made up stories about being in the Navy. You said she was dangerous to be around a leaner." Daniel's composure cracked further. "I was protecting Mom. Rachel was always so competitive, so determined to prove she was better than everyone. Do you know what it was like growing up with her? Always achieving, always succeeding, making the rest of us look bad." "So you erased her." My father's voice had hardened. "You erased your own sister because she made you feel inadequate. She abandoned us. She left for her precious Navy and never looked back." I tried to look back. I stepped closer to Daniel, close enough to see the individual beads of sweat on his forehead. Every deployment, I tried to stay connected. Every promotion, I wanted to share it with my family. Every Christmas, every birthday, every ordinary Tuesday, I thought about home, but you made sure I couldn't reach it. I pulled out my phone and opened the text messages from the previous day. I read them aloud, my voice carrying through the silent corridor. "Don't bother coming. Mom doesn't want you here. She said your name and cried. You've caused enough pain." I paused, letting the words settle. "Just stay on your little boat playing secretary. We've got this handled. The lawyer says everything's being divided among real family." Gasps from the gathered hospital staff. A nurse covered her mouth with her hand. Even the security guards looked horrified. Commander Torres spoke up, his voice carrying that particular edge of military disdain reserved for those who disrespect superior officers. "For clarification, the Admiral's little boat is the USS Theodore Roosevelt, a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Her secretary work involves direct briefings with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and regular communication with the National Security Council." Daniel's mouth opened and closed several times before words finally emerged. "I didn't know. How was I supposed to know? She never told us. I sent an official announcement when I made Admiral." My voice cut through his excuses like a blade. "Printed on Navy letterhead with the Secretary's seal. You told everyone it was spam." "I thought it was a joke, some kind of prank." "You thought your sister announcing flag rank in the United States Navy was a prank." I let the absurdity of that statement hang in the air. "Or you knew it was real and couldn't stand the thought of anyone knowing the truth." Meredith chose that moment to attempt an escape. She had been edging toward the elevator, phone clutched to her chest, clearly hoping to slip away while attention was focused on Daniel. But my flag aide was faster. "Mrs. Whitmore." Lieutenant Commander Reyes stepped smoothly into her path. "I wouldn't recommend leaving just yet. Mr. Hendricks is downstairs and has some questions about social media posts made from your account. Posts describing Rear Admiral Whitmore as unstable, delusional, and a pathological liar who abandoned her dying mother." Meredith's face went white. Those were private posts, in a family group. "Nothing on the internet is truly private, ma'am. And defaming a flag officer of the United States Navy can have serious consequences." I watched Meredith's careful social climbing crumble in real time. She had spent years cultivating an image as Daniel's devoted wife, the perfect partner to the perfect son. Now that image was disintegrating, and she had nowhere to hide. "Rachel," Uncle Vernon approached me, his usual pomposity replaced by something that might have been genuine remorse. "I owe you an apology, a significant one. I believed what Daniel told me. I voted against including you in the trust distributions because he said you had cut ties with the family, that you wanted nothing to do with us. And now," he straightened his shoulders, a gesture of someone trying to reclaim dignity he had surrendered. "Now I see I was manipulated. We all were. I'll be speaking with Mr. Hendricks about revising those decisions." Cousin Greg still hadn't moved from his frozen position against the wall. When my gaze found him, he flinched visibly. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Daniel always seemed so sure. I didn't think." "No, you didn't think. None of you did." I turned back to my father, who was still clutching my letters like they were sacred texts. The anger I expected to feel toward him wouldn't come. He was old, tired, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with age. He had been manipulated by his own son, convinced to abandon his daughter, and now he had to live with that knowledge. "Dad," I waited until he looked up at me. "Mom is in that room, and she doesn't have much time. I'm going to see her now. I'm going to hold her hand and tell her I love her and make sure she knows I never abandoned her. She should hear it from me, too." His voice was barely a whisper. "She should know I'm sorry. Then you can come in after I've had some time alone with her, but Daniel stays out." I looked at my brother, at the man who had spent 20 years dismantling my relationship with my own mother. "You've had her to yourself long enough. These last moments are mine." Daniel's face contorted with the old familiar rage, the fury of someone whose control was slipping away. "You can't just come in here and—" "I can." I stepped close enough that he had to look down at me, close enough that my quiet voice was for his ears alone. "You spent 15 years building a lie, Daniel. I spent 15 years building something real. We both got what we worked for." I turned to address the corridor at large, the gathered family members and hospital staff and gawking patients. He built his throne on my silence, but silence was never surrender. I simply had more important battles to fight. I looked toward my mother's door. Now I'm here for the only one that matters. I walked toward my mother's door, leaving the wreckage of my family's illusions behind me. Commander Torres and the other officers remained in the corridor, a silent wall between Daniel and the room he was no longer permitted to enter. I heard him start to protest, heard Torres' firm voice cutting him off, but the words didn't register. My focus had narrowed to a single point, the door in front of me and the woman waiting beyond it. I paused with my hand on the handle, drawing a breath that felt like the first one I'd taken in hours. For 20 years, I had imagined this moment, dreamed of it during long deployments when the distance between my ship and my mother felt like an unbridgeable ocean. Feared it during the worst nights, when I wondered if Daniel's lies had become her truth, if she would die believing I had abandoned her. Now I was here, and I was terrified. The door opened silently. The room beyond was dimly lit, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. Medical equipment hummed softly, monitoring vital signs that were slowly fading. And there, in the center of the room, in a bed that seemed far too large for her diminished frame, lay my mother. Eleanor Whitmore at 73 looked nothing like the woman who had raised me. The dementia and illness had stripped away so much, leaving behind a fragile shell that bore only traces of the mother I remembered. Her hair, once dark and thick, was now white and thin against the pillow. Her hands, which had tended gardens and baked cookies and brushed tangles from my hair, lay motionless on the blanket. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. But she was still here, still alive, and that was enough. I crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her bed, the same chair Daniel had probably occupied countless times, feeding her lies about the daughter who never called. I reached out and took her hand, carefully, gently, feeling the paper-thin skin and the bones beneath. "Hi, Mom." My voice came out rough, thick with emotions I had spent decades learning to suppress. "It's Rachel, I'm here, I made it." For a long moment, nothing happened. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing unchanged. I wondered if she could hear me at all, if she had already drifted too far into whatever comes next. Then her fingers twitched against mine. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening as they found my face. I watched confusion cross her features, followed by something that looked almost like pain. "Rachel," her voice was barely a whisper, cracked with disuse. "My Rachel." "Yes, Mom, I'm here." "But they said—" She swallowed hard, and I saw tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "They said you weren't coming. Daniel said you didn't want to see me, that I made you cry when I said your name." "That wasn't true." I squeezed her hand gently. "None of it was true. I always wanted to see you. I tried for years. I wrote letters. I called. But the messages never got through." Her brow furrowed with the effort of understanding. The dementia had taken so much, but in this moment, clarity seemed to be fighting its way through. "I missed you," she said. Every day, I kept asking Daniel why you never called, and he said you were busy, that you didn't have time for us anymore. I always had time for you. The tears I had held back for 20 years finally broke free, sliding down my cheeks and onto the collar of my dress whites. I always loved you. I never stopped. Her eyes moved from my face to my uniform, taking in the ribbons and insignia that told the story of my career. Recognition flickered across her features. You look so important, she murmured. So beautiful, are you? Are you really in the Navy? Yes, Mom. I'm an admiral. I command an aircraft carrier. A smile crossed her face, transforming her for just a moment into the mother I remembered. An admiral, my little girl, I always knew you would do something wonderful. Daniel told everyone I was a secretary. Her smile faded, replaced by something harder. Daniel lies. The words came out with surprising force. He's always lied, even when he was little. She closed her eyes. I forgot so many things, but I never forgot you. I kept dreaming about you, and when I woke up, I couldn't remember why you weren't there. I'm here now. I brought her hand to my lips and kissed it gently. I'm not going anywhere. We sat together in the dimming light, mother and daughter reunited after too many years apart. I told her about my life, the parts Daniel had hidden from her. My first command, the humanitarian missions, the sailors who had become like family when my blood family had been stolen from me. I told her about the places I had seen, the sunrises over foreign waters, the pride I felt every time I walked onto my ship. She listened, sometimes with her eyes open, sometimes drifting into that space between sleep and waking. But her hand never left mine. At some point, there was a soft knock at the door. My father entered hesitantly, his face aged by grief and guilt. He stood at the foot of the bed, unable to come closer, watching the wife he had failed to protect and the daughter he had allowed to be erased. Eleanor, his voice broke, I'm so sorry. My mother's eyes opened. She looked at him for a long moment, and I couldn't read the expression on her face. Forgiveness, disappointment, or simply the exhaustion of someone who no longer had energy for anger. Sit with us, Harold, she finally said. There's been enough distance. He pulled a chair to the other side of the bed and took her free hand. The three of us sat there together, a family broken and barely beginning to heal, as the sun set beyond the curtained windows. My mother passed away at 4:47 a.m. the following morning. I was holding her hand when her breathing slowed and finally stopped. My father was there too, along with the hospice nurse who had been monitoring her through the night. Daniel was not present. He had tried to force his way in several times during the night, but Commander Torres had remained at the door, implacable. In the end, my mother died knowing the truth. She died knowing her daughter had never abandoned her, had never stopped loving her, had crossed oceans to hold her hand one last time. It wasn't enough to make up for the years we had lost, but it was something. It had to be. The days that followed blurred together. Funeral arrangements. Legal consultations with Mr. Hendricks about the estate, which revealed the full extent of Daniel's financial manipulations. Conversations with family members who were only now beginning to understand how thoroughly they had been deceived. Daniel tried to approach me twice. The first time at the funeral home, he attempted to make excuses. The words barely registered. The second time at the burial, he asked if I could forgive him. I looked at my brother, at the man who had stolen my mother from me while she was still alive, and I gave him the only answer I had. I can release you, I said. Forgiveness takes longer, maybe one day, but not today. He had no response to that. The helicopter came for me 3 days after the funeral. I stood in the hospital parking lot, the same spot where I had landed what felt like a lifetime ago, watching the aircraft descend. My father had come to say goodbye, looking older than his years, but something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, something that might have been hope. Will you come back? He asked. After everything, will you come back? I considered the question. The house where I had grown up, now empty. The town that had witnessed my family's public unraveling. The father who had failed me but was finally trying to do better. You can still choose differently, Dad, I said. There's still time to be better. That's what I learned. It's never too late to become who you were supposed to be. I hugged him then for the first time in years. It was brief and awkward and didn't fix anything, but it was a start. The helicopter lifted off, and I watched Millbrook shrink below me. The house, the hospital, the cemetery where my mother now rested beside generations of Whitmores, the life they had tried to erase. I returned to my ship, to my command, to the family I had built from loyalty earned rather than blood assumed. And somewhere far below, my mother finally knew the truth. Her daughter hadn't abandoned her. Her daughter had become something extraordinary. She had just never been allowed to see it. Until the end. And that was enough. It had to be.